Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Monday edition of Conclave. This is our second speech, and I am Msgr Scott Rassbach here today to talk to you about rituals of warding. Would you open so that we can see our slide? Rituals of warding. The purposes of rituals of warding are very simple. And let's close it again so I don't have to look at the light. See? Rituals of warding, it's gone. Warding is there to provide the person or place being warded with a certain amount of protection. And we were just talking about being able to let everything go and not have any purchase, and to be able to allow the evil forces in the world to not have any purchase and to not have any attachment. And for the people, the vast majority of people who live in the world, this is not an option. They just don't have that sort of mindset. They have to have a place and a time in which to raise their family and to do the things that are important to them while here in this plane of existence. And a ritual of warding enables that to happen on multiple levels. A ritual of warding doesn't have to be a huge ritual. It can simply be a claiming of space. I have seen a couple of voodoo rituals which are absolutely wonderful to my mind, because it starts with a cleaning of the house. You move into a new house or a new space, and you clean your house so that you remove all of the influences from it. And then you stand on your front doorstep and put a coconut there, and then the lady of the house urinates on the coconut and kicks it down the street. And that is to get all of the evil spirits out of the house. And I think that is brilliant. I think it's an absolutely wonderful piece of folk magic, and is a very clear example of a warding, because it makes the house clean and it gets rid of the things that are bad, just like that. There's another ritual of warding that happens on Epiphany, where you write the initials of the three kings on the door lintel and the year. And that is a ritual that is supposed to provide the blessings of the three kings to the house for the entirety of the year. These are the sorts of things that people do to have a sort of sense of comfort in their space. And I think it has multiple parts to it. It definitely has a part of cleansing and purification. It has a part of marking, which is making it of your own. And then it has a part of expelling, which is making sure that things do not enter into that space. In a ceremonial magical context, there's a lot of different ways to do this. This is not something that every tradition seems to have it at some level, a sort of a cleansing. We have the voodoo tradition, which has, and a lot of folk magic has, a cleaning sort of ritual, and then a putting up of herbs or a sprinkling of water or any number of folk magic ways of dealing with the idea of having a clean and proper space. And religiously, we have a number of these sorts of things as well. We have the consecration of a church, and if you would open up, this is an Anglo-Saxon drawing of a consecration of a church, which allows the church to be a space that is set apart for the worship of God. It is a special space, and it is warded against the influences of evil, and it is warded against the influences of the temporal world, which is why you have this idea of sanctuary for criminals. Criminals can go into a church in ancient times, well, medieval times, all the way up to now in some places. You can enter into a holy place, and while you're there, have a bit of succor from the law while you're trying to figure out what to do next. And sometimes that law is working correctly as justice, and sometimes it's working incorrectly as tyranny. But in either case, the power of the religious has often given a space so that they can have time to figure out what their next move is. And it doesn't always work that way. I mean, there are definitely secular powers that will disregard the consecrated ground. But more often than not, the social consequences of disregarding that sort of consecrated space is not worth violating the contract. Now, from a more mystical point of view, let's take a look at circles. Circles. There's a Solomonic circle made by our own friend Frater Ashenchasen. I'm not entirely sure which one this is. Jeffrey might know. It's a goetic circle. So this is for the protection of the magician, if I'm not mistaken. The magician stands in the center of it, and then he has circles around the side with, I'm thinking that might be the Shema Mephresh on the outside of it. Is that right?
If it's from the lesser key, it is all of the divine names in Stirrup.
Okay. There you go. But the idea of having a circle of protection is very, very old and very, very well used in any sort of magical and neo-pagan grouping. Just about everybody has a circle that you can use. And in fact, sometimes I've seen it used that even the cincture, which the monks and the priests wear, is a circle of protection and is supposed to keep them from iniquity and wickedness.
I was just going to mention this. Lon Milo Duquette has been on my brain in the last 24 hours of the previous talk. He was our main speaker in 2007, and he told a story about doing a ritual of evocation where he used a cincture or a belt as a magic circle, and then in order to continue, much like we were talking the contemplative thing, in order to continue the ritual throughout the day, he picked it up and tied it around his waist to ensure that he was protected as he left to go do whatever he needed to do.
Exactly. So that idea of having a circle around you as protection is definitely consistent within ceremonial magic. It's not ubiquitous. I mean, it's not everywhere, but just about every tradition appears to have it, and especially traditions that have more of a structure to them. So you'll find it in Tibetan Buddhism and in Eastern magic. You will find it in ceremonial magic in the West. You will find it in certain practices of voodoo. There's all kinds of instances of having a circle. The other idea, and here's another circle. This one is from the Heptameron, and this is a daily circle. So every day you have a different circle that you use in order to do whatever it is you're trying to do. And I think this one contains the spirit that you're trying to summon and not necessarily the magician itself, or himself or herself. But again, you'll see you have names of God around the outside, you have names of angels, and then you have certain other words that have various meanings, and you have stars, which is another great feature of lots of protective technology, shall we say. So circles is my first idea of that. The second idea I want to talk about is fortresses. And let's, there we go. There is a practice in Tibetan Buddhism called the Vajra Palace. This is a Vajra, or an example of a Vajra. And, yes, diamond or thunderbolt. And what a practitioner can do is create the idea of a wall of Vajras that separate them from the malignant influences that exist in the Tibetan worldview. So before they start, or as they're doing their ritual practice, they create this image of a fortress of these shapes that keeps out any influences that they don't want to let in. Can you close that? And that's basically the idea of a lot of these warding practices, is that you take a space and you say, this is my space, and all the other spirits and influences need to stay out unless I invite them in. Now, there are some people who think that this is a very aggressive act. If you have a worldview where there is a spirit-filled world, to say that this space is mine and none else can enter in here is aggressive, and it will attract attention. So that's why you have to have certain strengths and certain barriers to that in order to make sure that it's reinforced, if you subscribe to that worldview. I have seen people also make offerings before they do these kinds of zones. So they will make an offering to the spirits and say, you spirits, I am going to claim this space for myself. I'm letting you know this. Here's payment for allowing me to do this space, and then you do it. And so that can be a sort of less aggressive version thereof. Certain spirits aren't going to care, depending on their attitude. But a lot of people find that to be very helpful for them to perform this act, which could be seen as very aggressive. And then we have the idea of a sacred space. So in a sacred space, we claim the idea as being outside of space and time. And we say that right in our ritual, that we have, and now I need to find it. If we look in the opening of our Mass, which is actually on page, there it is, 34. United as one sacred communion with those who were and those who will be, we declare this space and our time here to be holy. Together with the Most High, we raise a temple of living stones from the myriad with which we have been blessed, both light and dark. As one, we fashion a temple for your power, an altar for its reception, and a sanctuary for your people. That act in and of itself is a sort of warding. It is a declaration that this space and this time belongs to the community that is here, and that it is different. It is a setting apart, which is definitely the third portion of any sort of warding, is a setting apart. I don't know if I told everybody, but this sword is the warding implement of my household. When we moved into our house, I used this sword to tell the spirits and entities around the place that this space was the space for my family and my friends, and that they would have to respect that. And I gave them an offering saying, we've moved in here, I know we're new, you're welcome to come and talk to me. However, this is ours now, and this is what we're going to do. I have removed the sword from the space, and since I have done so, interesting things have been happening around the house. My son has been having a whole bunch of trouble with various entities from his past. My wife has had certain things happening with just stuff coming to a head. And so it's been very interesting to see that while the sword is here at Conclave, it is, the protection seems to be waning a little bit. And so I'm anxious to get home and put the sword back up in its place and remind everyone that this ward is there not for me, but for my family and for my friends, which is another use of warding in most places, is to protect not only the practitioner, but the people who are around the practitioner. Bray was talking about the lack of attachment and purchase. And as my point of that is simply that that is wonderful for the person who can reach that level of detachment, but not everyone can. And there may be people you care about, which is a slight bit of attachment in and of itself. But I do believe that one needs to be able to protect those around you. And that's a good use for rituals of warding. Just to have these spaces where those who still have attachment can feel as though they have a space of sanctuary and succor. Now, I had intended to do the opening of the church or the service of the Logos as an example of a warding space, but I have a feeling we've all seen that numerous times. I have a couple of other rituals, and I was wondering if anyone wanted to witness that sort of thing. Okay. So, a very simple one. Again, I'm going to play it safe and say that any spirits that are here, I'm giving you guys this space back when I'm done. So be fine with us while we do this. The very simplest protection spell involves a sword and a circle. I seize the circle. I consecrate and bless this circle in the name of God Yao, that it may be a shield to me, and that protection in the name of the most powerful and invincible God against all malignant spirits and powers in the name of Yao. Yao is calling. Apparently, that is exactly it. That was very perfect timing. Apparently, EIO has a message. And it's probably got something to do with timeshare in China to sell. That happened to me at 5 o'clock this morning. Anyway, so that is actually the very simplest sort of rite of protection, right there. I have a circle of protection around me on the ground, and spirits can't pass. I've got the protection of a deity. I have a boundary. I have a space that's set aside just for me. And it's very easy for me to dismiss it, as I already have, as I walked out of it. But I can do it more explicitly simply by saying, in the name of the great God EIO, my space is dispelled. And voila. Not very impressive, but it's very interesting as you take and visualize these sorts of things. And you can sit in the middle of it and let your imagination run wild of spirits coming through and bonking into the edge and that sort of thing. It can be a very interesting way to take and get a space for yourself to sit and calm down. Another wonderful ritual is, of course, the lesser banishing ritual of the Pentagram, which I'm sure will be familiar to anybody who's done ceremonial magic in any level whatsoever. If you could open that up again. This is a drawing of what happens in the lesser ritual of the Pentagram. It starts with the east, here, and the invocation of the god names around the edges. The god names are interesting in that they all have 4 Hebrew letters. That is your first layer of protection, or your first layer of technically your first layer is the pentagrams themselves, which are closest to the magician. Here, I don't know why that's earth. That's interesting that that's an earth pentagram in this. I've always seen it as an air pentagram there. So this drawing must be from a tradition of which I am not familiar. Maybe it's a Wiccan tradition, where they would put earth in the east. In some traditions, you find air in the east and earth in the north. But the fire in the south and the water in the west is pretty traditional. But those two are flipped for some reason. I found this diagram early this morning, so I didn't have a chance to review it quite as well as I would have liked. But it does have the idea of the pentagrams here so that they are closest, and you have the elements closest to you. And then you have a layer of divinity outside of that, which sort of consecrates the area around you. And then you have a layer of angelic protection on the very outside, so that you have a set of servitors which are watching the very, very outside of it. Magically, the lesser banishing ritual of the Pentagram is a very complex ritual, and there have been tomes and tomes written on it and the various meanings of it. But at its very lowest level, it is a banishing ritual which will provide you with space in which to work whatever sort of magic you're looking for. It also has, because of the god names and the angel names, it has a certain amount of blessing involved with it as well, and there's a certain amount of invocation that's involved with it as well, so I'm not necessarily going to do it in this space. But it is definitely a classic in ceremonial magic as a way to delineate the space in which you're going to do your work and to sort of create your temple. One of the things I've always found interesting about this ritual is that whether you are in the northern or southern hemisphere, these correspondences apply. And that gets kind of interesting because north and south are different. In the north, in the The versions of it I've seen in the north, you have cold. In the northern hemisphere, north is cold. In the southern hemisphere, north is warm. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to have fire in the south and earth in the north. However, this is supposedly one of the theories I've seen is that this is a recreation of the temple at Jerusalem. And in the temple of Jerusalem, you have the mountains in the north, you have the sun rising in the east, you have the ocean in the west, and you have the desert in the south. And that's the reason that they put those elemental attributions there. Now, that's one explanation I've seen, and there are just as many explanations as there are magicians, more than likely. But this is one that I find very convenient and like using a lot. That you are recreating the Temple of Solomon in the person of the center of the ritual. This is where I got my start in ceremonial magic, was doing this ritual. I did it a lot. And I find it to be very effective and comforting to do this ritual. I find that it is very, because I have done it so many times, it is a very relaxing sort of ritual for me to do. I also find that it definitely does help to calm my mind. Once I have that ritual done, I am centered in the center of this space. And from that point, I can take action. I can do whatever summoning I'm looking for. I can do whatever centering exercise I'm looking for. I can wrestle with whatever problem that I happen to have. But because I have taken and set the wards and set that space aside, I have the calm, peace, sanctuary, succor to move to my next step and to consider. Can you close that again? Questions? Jenny?
Not necessarily for the protective benefits, but in delineating the space, do you feel like making your physical space liminal kind of adds to whatever you're trying to do?
Definitely. I definitely find that it concentrates the perception I have that we are in a much more spiritual world than my normal ignorant state allows. It definitely allows me to see connections that aren't necessarily there. It allows me to see the beings that aren't necessarily there, because it tells my senses that I'm moving into a space that's very different than the space that I usually reside in. Ben, I'm going to go with you first.
Right. Along these lines, there's an implication to the alleged higher aspects or more esoteric aspects of, for example, the LBRP, or its Aurum Solis equivalent, which creeps into our material.
Right.
Which really gets back down to the practical work of war. I'm referring to the alchemy of it.
Mm-hmm.
For the LBRP to work, at one point you place yourself in the center of the universe.
Right.
You now claim credit for the four quarters. You have to invest yourself.
Right.
You have to take that risk which was taken, at least in Gnostic terms, from going from the pleroma to the world of manifestation. And then you have to return to the center.
Mm-hmm.
And from an alchemical perspective, or a fake Egyptian perspective, you're taking yourself and putting yourself together again. Well, if you do this back and forth, it seems to me that by admitting to the need for protection, you admit to your vulnerability in the incarnate world, however advanced you may think yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You admit to your complicity, you take responsibility for it,
Mm-hmm.
which is very alchemical too. You must suffer in alchemy.
Right.
And yet by going back to the center, there's always this claim that there is at first refuge and later redemption.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do this enough times, forget climbing up the ladder. Those wards are going to get more and more powerful in and of themselves.
Right.
Because of what you've invested them with the higher work you're doing too.
Your eminence.
I was just going to say, talking about also, once again, kind of blurring the line or moving over between simple and complex, and for those who find, ritual or diagrams, things to be, challenging, much in the same way that I find math to be challenging and frustrating and actually kind of annoying. I like ritual, I dislike math, it's kind of funny.
You like music and dislike math. That's also funny.
I dislike math a lot. And, I take a look at my home budget. That's 9/10 of my problem with money. I have to think about numbers.
Okay, I'm going to award you, and what are you talking about?
But to kind of look also, I mean, there are simple things I think that we take for granted that also have the same type of, whether you visualize it or not, the same type of warding effect that have been around for ages and from mainstream sources. Take, for example, the so-called lorica, or breastplate of St. Patrick. Right? Where I rise today in the strength of so on and so forth. But you get to the middle of it, and it's Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ above me, Christ.
Right.
And that prayer itself is kind of the equivalent of Lon taking the magic circle, tying it around his waist, and going about his day.
Right. And there's definitely an idea in certain Christian circles of putting on the armor of God, where you take and do your prayer first thing in the morning, and you're putting on your armor of God so that the evil wickedness of the world cannot affect you in your attempts to go about your daily business.
I have rituals for keeping math out.
Yes, it's called the budget. Another very interesting ritual that I've heard about is called the Hepta Sphere. Hepta Sphere. And the Hepta Sphere is to keep planetary energies out of your personal microcosmos. It's a protection against malign astrological influences. And again, you have to have a certain worldview in order for that to be effective. However, many people who do ceremonial magic have this worldview, so it can be very effective for them. If you know that some malign planet is entering your sun sign, it's probably a good thing to do it if that sort of thing bothers you. Or Mercury retrograde, which is a wonderful thing among magicians, and especially magicians that use technology. It becomes a very big issue. Could you open that up again? I think I have a Hepta Sphere. I do. So this Hepta Sphere, I do not necessarily know relates directly to this ritual, but it does have some points in it that I wanted to bring out. You have, of course, 7 planets, and in this, they're going in a direction that's all flat. In this, the Hepta Sphere ritual I've seen, they have directional attributions to the different planets. And in the process of enacting this ritual, you have the vowel sounds of the Greek language. And the vowel sounds all have an intonation which is associated with each of the planets. So that when you are making your ward and your dismissal, you have that sort of tone that goes out and protects you from that influence. And the interesting thing about that is that it's one of the few rituals I've found that uses sounds that don't necessarily have to be made by the human. You can get a device that makes the tones for the planets, and you can ding that thing as you're making that vowel sound. The majority of wardings and ceremonial magic use the intonation of God forms, like that vibration that I was doing, the ee-ow, that sort of thing that makes your whole body vibrate. And this Hepta Sphere one actually has the ability to hit a note as you're doing it, to have the sound move out from a non-human source, which makes a certain amount of sense if you're talking about a cosmic sort of barrier. I don't know how detailed you want me to get on that, or if you want me to try and perform it. It's not one of my favorites, so I haven't done it a lot, but I can certainly try. My Greek pronunciation is terrible, so I don't know if that's something we want to look at. But again, it has certain ideas that are consistent with these ideas of warding. It has a directional attributes, so it forms a sphere, starting with the zenith. at the very top. It has, what I find very interesting is it has directional attributions for the planets. And as we know, the planets move throughout the heavens, so their location at any single time is a variable. However, they actually attribute it to cardinal directions so that you have, as it's a ritual, you have a set way of thinking about these different planets. And these are the 7 classical planets, not the 9 planets that we know. So the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. That's 7. Look at that. I counted on my fingers, so my math is good. And then it talks about another interesting thing about the Hepta Sphere ritual is that it talks about abrasax. And abrasax in Greek has a numerical value of 365, which gives you protection through the entire course of the sun. So that is a very interesting ritual, and if you want more details on it, I'd be happy to share them with you after the talk. I don't feel comfortable performing it necessarily, though. The next one is called an Angelic Cube. When we do our Mass, we form an angelic square because we have the east and the west, we have the north and the south, but we don't have the top and the bottom. The Angelic Cube is a ritual that invokes the angels for the top and the bottom, putting you in a little holy box. This, I think, would be very useful for you in a time of great upset, or if you are seeking contact with a spirit which is very Gnostically oriented and beyond the archons. Because the angelic protection that it gives you is such an all-encompassing thing, it provides a holy space that is very holy and very different than even our own setting aside of sacred space. This one uses permutations of the divine name of Iao. So for the zenith, for instance, you use Oi, and you use different permutations of that sacred name. And it uses the angels of Sandalphon and the above. Oh, I'm sorry, Metatron at the above and Sandalphon at the below, which anybody who's used to Kabbalistic thought knows that Metatron is usually high up, the voice of God, and Sandalphon is usually at a more material level, being very close to the world as far as archangels go. And then once you call the angels and use the divine names to set the directions, there is a phrase that I enjoyed a lot, which is, a cube within a cube, world within a world, I place myself in the aditum, emanated from the pleroma itself. May the Logos sanctify my mind, the Sophia arise within my heart. Lucas.
This reminds me of the BOTA's cube of space. Is there a relation?
It may be stolen from there. I got it from Jason Miller, and Jason Miller had listed it in one of his books. I've used it several times for more Gnostic sorts of meditation, and I found it to be very fruitful for that purpose. Yes?
I was say, well, not specifically invoking angels for the height or the depth. The height or the depth in the Mass is, of course, covered or at least cleansed by the water and the incense, which go in different directions.
Right, and I think that
And
those...
the elevation of the chalice and the kneeling of the priest. There's lots of...
Oh, yes, there's lots of up and down, and I'm not necessarily dissing the Mass for not having that. I'm just saying that this has a very explicit way of sealing those places off so that you're not getting any undue influences from those directions. Whereas in the Mass, we do a lot of that, but it's implicit.
Yeah.
This is also a much shorter ritual than the Mass, so it just provides you with your space, and then you do your stuff on the inside. It could be very interesting to do sort of vision quest or visionary sorts of meditations One thing I haven't done, which I would be very interested in doing, is something along the lines of the Jesus prayer in that kind of environment and see what happens. I think that would be very neat.
One more thing I didn't think about until now, that, not so much when we cross ourselves in liturgy or ritual, but when an object is blessed with the sign of the cross, particularly in Mass, it covers those directions. Because typically you make a cross that's, 3D essentially.
Right.
As opposed to 2 when we do it for ourselves.
Mm-hmm. That is definitely very true. I like that a lot. Lastly, I want to talk about a ritual called, by Jason Miller, the Adamantium Temple. Adamantine Temple. In this ritual, there is a certain amount of calling up of energy and a certain amount of emanating that energy from the magician's fingertips. And he emanates that energy in the form of a tetrahedron of fire. And then, using mystical math and sacred geometry, he forms a barrier around himself or herself of a tetrahedron of fire. The simplest of the Platonic forms, if I'm not mistaken, solids, Platonic solids. So that there is a very, very definite separation of the magician from the rest of the cosmos. I'm not entirely sure what you would use this for, but this seems like a step above some of the other things that I've seen, simply because of the multiplication aspect. You have, it's a very fractal sort of protection ritual, where you take and you create the one, the first, the beginning of your protective sigils, and then you multiply it out to infinity until that's all you can see and you are completely surrounded by it. And that to me seems like a very interesting and powerful sort of ritual. And there would have to be a certain amount of preparation for something like that, because you would have to do a lot of visualization to be able to hold that kind of an image and establish it before you started doing your other work. I think that the practice of doing that ritual in and of itself might take years to actually get down. Or an afternoon, depends on how much of a magician you are and how good you are at visualization. But to really perfect it, I think practice would be essential for something along those lines. Lastly, one of my favorite banishing rituals and ways of cleansing myself is Psalm 91. Psalm 91 has a definite protective feel to it, and I love the verbiage of it. And so I'm going to read Psalm 91 because I think it's a great psalm, and it is used a lot in folk magic for protection. Can you close that again? Thank you. So here we are with Psalm 91. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress. In Him I will trust. Surely He shall deliver thee from the snare of the fowler and from the noisome pestilence. He shall cover thee with His feathers, and under His wings shalt thou trust. His truth shall be thy shield and buckler. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day, nor for the pestilence that walketh in darkness, nor for the destruction that wasteth at noonday. 1,000 shall fall by thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee. Only with thine eyes shalt thou behold and see the reward of the wicked, because thou hast made the Lord, which is my refuge, even the Most High, thy habitation. There shall be no evil befall thee, neither shall any plague come nigh thy dwelling. For He shall give His angels charge over thee to keep thee in all thy ways. They shall bear thee up in their hands, lest thou dash thy foot against a stone. Thou shalt tread upon the lion and adder, the young lion and the dragon shalt thou trample under foot. Because He hath set His love upon me, therefore will I deliver him. I will set him on high, because he hath known my name. He shall call upon me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him and honor him. With long life will I satisfy him and show him my salvation. This has a long tradition of being a warding psalm, and it's pretty obvious as to why. Being under the refuge, under the habitation, with the shield and the buckler and the protection. And it's definitely contributes to that idea of the armor of God that happens under certain Christian ideas of warding and protection. I find it very interesting, too, that the devil quotes it when he's talking to Jesus in the desert. And he says, jump from this high height, and the angels will catch you, and lest you dash your foot upon a stone. I think that's very interesting that the devil uses that piece of scripture in order to tempt Jesus in the desert. And Jesus, of course, says, you don't have to test the Lord your God. So, in conclusion, I think that warding becomes a very useful technique when you are struggling. It becomes a very useful technique when you are trying to put yourself in a certain mindset. And it becomes a very useful technique when you are trying to set aside sacred space for people who may not be at the same position at which you are. And so that's pretty much what I have to say about warding. And if we have questions, I'm more than happy to try and answer them.
So I'm just curious, so I'm reading a book by Michael Ford about Luciferian Gnosticism.
Okay.
In that practice, you don't create a circle when you're doing ritual.
Right.
Because you're your own divine entity that will protect yourself and everything else around you that you include in that. I'm just curious if you had any experiences arguing with people about that, or with people that work from that kind of standpoint. I'm just curious.
I have not. Because I have tended to run mostly with Gnostics who are also ceremonial magicians, so the circle is kind of a given in a lot of those environments. I don't see necessarily that you need a circle. I would never say that a circle is a necessity for doing any sort of magical or spiritual work. What I say is that in certain worldviews, it's definitely helpful. It depends entirely on the spiritual basis you're working in at that particular point in time. Myself, I tend to be fairly adept at switching worldviews, so I have absolutely no problem doing a contemplative service with no ritual around me at all and just meditating and trying to touch the divine. And I have no problem working with the hierarchy of the medieval god with his choirs of angels and calling up demons and telling them to do shit because I can, because I'm a viceroy of the divine. I have the power to bind and loose, and I can use that worldview if need be. So if a Sethian thinks that the divine within him is sufficient to protect him from the forces of evil, then it's probably true.
I was just going to add to that in the sense that, I mean, people have different ideas whether or not, magic is external or all in your head or any number of those things. And there's certainly, you look at some of the grimoire traditions and like such and such a spirit prefers this type of incense.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure they don't have a nose, and they probably don't care a lick about incense. The incense is about bringing you into the right state of consciousness or the right preparation for the ritual. So to a certain degree, some people could say that, I guess you could argue that there's an external effectiveness to a circle, but at the same time, the circle could be said to put you in a particular state of mind internally for your own work. I mean, I do think things actually happen on the level of the real, and it's not necessarily in our heads. But however that works, I think the certain ritual actions are designed to correspond, as within, so without, to correspond to internal things. So I think if somebody had other practices, I guess that brings about the same effect as a circle, then they can do that.
I think,
however, like the physical knowledge of going and physically locking my door,
right,
checking my door at the end of the night before I go to bed, versus I got that. That's fine.
and as far as that goes, like correspondences and that sort of thing, I'm not entirely sure that there's not an effect that happens outside. I mean, I definitely think that there is an interplay between the internal and the external in any sort of magic.
Yeah, so do I, but some people might treat it like Dumbo's feather.
Right, exactly, because you have the feather, then you can fly.
Yeah, but the flying was there.
The flying was there the entire time. And there does seem to be a tradition among adepts where they slowly fall away from more and more complex ritual and get more and more simple. Which is where I talked when I was telling Mark about how the mystic goes whoosh, and the magician goes and kind of explores all of the things around the tree as he's moving up there, and the mystic just goes boom right there. The magician eventually gets to that point where this sort of stuff starts to fall away, and you don't necessarily need to be able to get into, you don't need to do an LBRP in order to establish a space. You can draw a circle with your sword, or you can use this, or you don't need a space because you carry that space within you. But it's a different process because the magician starts out with more accretion to begin with. And that falling away process takes more time, I think. I have a deep respect for people that can sit and pray in that boring way, because I have to tire my mind out before I can get to that place. And that is one of the things I say about Gnosticism, is it's so freaking confusing, so that we can eventually make our brains break and access that simplicity of heart and faith and love that exists in some people just naturally. Ceremonial magic isn't for everyone. You don't need to do it. I don't think you need to do any of these practices. However, I do think they can be helpful for people of a certain mindset and a certain worldview. And that's the reason I do these presentations on these sorts of things, is to say, well, maybe if you're having trouble with spirituality, you need to look at this sort of thing to establish a space for yourself. If it's as simple as the service of the Logos, or if you can just sit on your cushion, and once you have your cushion, you can enter that space. Or if you need to call upon all of the Hebrew deities, all of the 72 names of God in order to put yourself into that place. But all of these practices eventually start to lead to the same way when they're done regularly, routinely, and with an eye towards that sort of goal. And not everyone has that goal. That's something else to consider, is that a lot of magicians and sorcerers don't have the goal of ascent and union as their central point. And so they need this stuff because they're dealing with spirits on a level that's much lower than what we're talking about. They're not I mean, when you're talking about sorcerers and you're talking about people who are working with their community to do spells to help them get out of jail and to do these sorts of things, this sort of what they call practical magic or thaumaturgy or folk magic, you need to have wards and you need to have these sorts of things because you're working with powers that can come back and bite you in the ass.
I'm looking forward to seeing the YouTube comments on this lecture.
I'm sure. And as a disclaimer, this is all my own point of view. And there's nothing saying that you can't do this sort of practical magic and be working on ascent. But I'm not trying to say that at all. But there are some people who are not working on ascent at all and aren't looking for it. So there's I've actually talked to people, as weird as it seems to me, that don't seem to think you need to do ascent at all. Okay, fine. I don't get it, but that's the way they go. Yes, Lucas.
You mentioned the cincture as a sort of
Portable magical circle.
Are there other examples that you might be able to cite? Of portable warding and portable.
I hope I was off camera for that.
You are actually just right off camera.
Portable magical circles?
Sure.
There you go. Anything you wear around your neck is a portable magical circle. The pin you've got on your coat could be a portable magical circle. I mean, circles are everywhere. So a lot of it depends on your tradition and how creative you are. So
My bald ass head is
my bald ass head is a circle as well. I just got to get the god names tattooed in the right places, and we'll be all set. Mark.
Well, I was just going to say that in terms of ascent, I don't necessarily think of that process as ascent.
Mhm.
Or, I mean, it could as easily be descent or side, lateral. That's not the,
Well, it's centered.
yeah.
Right.
Right.
It's centering prayer, so
Right.
you're actually getting centered. But a union is what I'm actually talking about. It's not, I use ascent as a term for union, because in my personal worldview, the divine is up. I don't know why, it just always has been. Probably a Roman Catholic upbringing. But, as a Gnostic, divine resides within and without, and so you're centering, you're joining with the divine in whatever capacity. For some people, it's not a priority. And for us, it happens to be. It's one of those things we like to do. And there's a lot of magical practices that can help you with that, especially if you're not the sit on the cushion and meditate kind. And I definitely have to do a lot of preparatory work before I can sit, which sucks. Anybody else? Anyone else have comments on wording? Any other thoughts? Anybody do anything in their house? What do you do?
Burn a specific mixture of incense.
Okay,
Do the Lord's Prayer around each window.
nice. A good consecration right there. Very good. Yeah?
The chalk marking.
You do the chalk marking, the at Epiphany? Very nice. I've always wanted to do that and I keep forgetting. I never have chalk.
I do, because somebody sent me some.
Yep. Less chalk,
sauce.
less chalk, fresh from Shoppers Drug Mart.
You need to send me
I
some.
left it in the box even, so.
They're Crayola.
Maybe I'll have you bless me some while you're here. I'll get you to do that tomorrow at Mass.
If only you were a priest or something.
I could do it myself,
Yeah.
but it's better coming from the patriarch.
Much like Psalm 91, there's a chromatic surah that's
Oh.
very useful for warding against the malign influence of women who blow on knots and whatnot like that.
Oh, okay.
So, do you know of any other particular canonical words like such as Psalm 91 or Surah Balak?
I don't know of any offhand. There's always the blessing and sprinkling with water.
There's lots of saint-associated traditions.
Mm-hmm.
When we bought the house that we were in, we moved in, and funnily enough, we're right across the way from St. Bridget's Catholic School. And so we bought this house and we moved in. And I didn't, you don't notice it coming in, of course I noticed it when I was coming down the stairs, but above the door, kind of implanted in the frame, is St. Bridget's cross.
Oh, yeah?
Is that
Okay.
correct? So there's lots of saint traditions.
We have some of those up
Yeah,
too. Those are good.
Associated with warding.
Do you have any examples of canonical or traditional sorts of wording like that? Which one? Oh, yeah, Psalm 23. That's a good one. I know in Jewish culture there's the little scroll. The which one? Mezuzah. Okay, that you put up on the door frame. Okay.
And in some Orthodox houses, they put on every door frame in the house.
Wow. Okay. Very cool. Anybody else? Okay, anything else? Then I'm going to go and call it good. Thank you very much.